Hi, welcome to the Propaganda Game. I'm Buzz Allen with the Accelerated Learning Foundation, and this video is about how to use the online propaganda game to play with multiple players. The multiple player version of the propaganda game is really the most interesting because it allows players to debate and discuss their own interpretations of which techniques they think are being used in any particular example. Most natural examples of propaganda use multiple techniques. The really powerful ones use them very effectively. And the multiplayer game gives players a chance to explore this with each other as they try to predict which technique the most people in the game are going to think is the one being used in a primary way. Now, the multiplayer game of online propaganda uses the same online interface as the single-player game. That is, one only needs one computer, a laptop, or a tablet in order to generate examples for the whole group. The main difference is how voting occurs. For multiplayer voting, each player has their own paper voting sheet and after seeing an example writes down their selection for the primary technique they think was being used. These votes are then revealed together, and this establishes a majority position. The players in the minority then get a chance to argue for their technique and try to convince majority players to switch their votes. There's a second round of voting by the majority players only, and this settles the final positions and scoring for the example. Now, if the first vote ends in a tie, then every player gets to argue for their technique before the second round of voting occurs, and everyone gets to vote in that second round. If it's still tied after this second round of voting, then the author's choice is consulted online, and that counts as the tie-breaking vote. Now, the main difference between the single-player version of propaganda online and a multiplayer game are bold challenges. Any time after the second round of voting happens, but before any author's opinion has been consulted, any minority player can make a bold challenge if they believe that their technique matches the author's choice. If they're correct, a bold challenger will get a hefty bonus in scoring, but if they're incorrect, there'll be a heavy penalty. So to prepare to start the match, one wants to log into the propagandagame.org website. One logs in and goes to the Play Online menu item. Click on Multiplayer. This will bring up a series of PDFs that one should download and print out to use to play the multiplayer game. There's a score sheet that we only need one copy of per group because all the players' names can go on this to keep track of the scoring for this particular match. Then there are voting sheets for each individual player. They write their name at the top, and then for each example there's a line for the initial vote and the final vote. And then there are sheets that have technique definitions for each of the sections in the game. And there are 6 major sections in the propaganda game labeled Section A through Section F. We'd recommend most beginners start playing with just a single section, and in fact the section that most people find easiest to start with are techniques of exploitation because the definitions and titles are concepts that most people are familiar with. We'd then recommend players going on to Section C, Techniques of Irrelevance, Section B, Techniques of Language, then Section A, Techniques of Self-Deception, before going to the sections E and F, which are techniques of form and techniques of maneuver, which tend to be somewhat more sophisticated concepts. One player should be selected from the group to serve as the web operator, and that player is the one that operates the computer or tablet in order to generate examples. This role is usually handled by a teacher in a classroom setting, and teachers would also usually use a projector with the computer so that all the groups in the room could see the examples. When it's time to actually play the match, you start by logging into propagandagame.org, click on Play Online, and choose the single player option. This brings up the selection screen. We recommend clicking on the Selection Process button. And this brings up the selection wheel. And you've probably seen this before if you've used the online version. The various section groups and their icons are arranged around the outer portion of the wheel. There are also sphere categories in the center. If we're playing with a beginning group and they're just going to use, say, the exploitation section, we click on the exploitation icon. Many people also like to select examples with images because the more recent examples tend to be from memes, and many people find images more interesting. One can also toggle between the author's version or the popular version for what is selected as the authority for a match. But then once one has configured what one wants, one clicks on the Ready button. We can also click on spheres like politics, which will bring up the various categories like campaigns, policy, and partisanship if we want to narrow the focus for the examples even further. I'm going to leave it that we're selecting just exploitation techniques with images. Program then searches for examples and offers either 10, 20, or 30 examples to play with. I'm going to select 10. And this brings up the actual game interface with the Go button to get started. Notice that only Section D, exploitation techniques, have been selected. The web operator clicks on the Go button, and this brings up the first example. The web operator can then click on the magnifying glass to magnify the example and show it around to the other players, or read it out loud so everyone can see the example and then vote. Once people have had a chance to look at the example, each player votes by writing down the name of the primary technique that they think the example uses on the initial line of their personal voting sheet. And again, they're looking at those definitions off their own personal copy of the PDF having technique definitions for the particular section they're playing with. These votes are then revealed simultaneously, and that establishes a majority opinion for that example and minority opinions or a tie. The persuasion round then starts, in which each majority opinion voter gets 2 minutes to convince the majority voters of the correctness of their choice. The majority voters then vote again, and only the majority voters. They do this by writing down a new technique choice on the final line of their personal voting sheet. These final votes are revealed simultaneously, and this determines the scoring for the example. Now, if there is a tie for the majority after the first vote, then everyone in the match gets 2 minutes to convince the others of the correctness of their choice, and everyone then votes again to determine the final majority. If it's still tied after the second vote, then the author's choice is consulted online by the web operator, and this serves as a tiebreaker. Now, the way the scoring works is if there are no bold challenges after the final voting, then each majority player will gain 10 points for that example, and minority players will get no points. If a minority player does issue a bold challenge, and they do that by saying challenge after the final vote's complete, then the web operator checks the author or popular choice. Do this by clicking on the section letter that is activated. In this case, it's exploitation, and then we have to vote. I'll say that it's folksy appeal. Click on vote, and it turns out that was correct. The author's primary vote was folksy appeal. If the web operator wants to read the comment from the author, they click on the comment section, and they can read the actual author's justification or explanation for why they thought it was that particular technique. This then hopefully settles the tie, and then the scoring is determined. But before continuing on, the players can just verbally decide how they want to rate this example with how many stars. Let's say they say a 3-star example, clicking on the stars, click on rate, and now they're set up to do the next example by clicking on the Go button. Now, ties for the majority opinion after the final vote are also settled by reference to the author or popular opinion choice. That choice will be serving as the tiebreaker. If it determines a majority, then each majority player gets 10 points and everyone else gets 0 points. But if the author's answer or the popular opinion does not break the tie, then everyone gets 0 points for that example, and we go on to the next one. The way bold challenge scoring is dealt with is if a bold challenge is issued by any minority player after the persuasion round has a final vote. After that's complete, if a player issues a bold challenge, then the answer given by either the author or the popular version will be consulted to resolve the scoring for the match. If the challenger is correct in a bold challenge, the challenger will get 10 points for every player in the majority who voted against them in the final vote. All these majority players will also each lose 10 points. For example, if a minority player, Susie, makes a correct bold challenge against 3 majority players in the final vote, then she gets 30 points for that example, and each of the majority players will lose 10 points. If the challenge is incorrect, he or she loses 10 points for every player in the majority, and the majority players each get 10 points. So if Susie incorrectly bold challenges 3 majority players, she will lose 30 points, and each of the majority players gets 10. The score sheet has a row for each player in the match, and a column for each of the examples that are used in that match. When the scoring is determined for an example based on majority voting, then that score for each player is written down in the score cell, and a running total is kept directly below. That way one can just look at any point in time and see how people are doing in the match. One can also keep track of what each player's role was in that particular example. You can circle the capital M if they were in the majority, the small m if they were in the minority, and if that player issued a bold challenge, then you can circle BC. This way the score sheet keeps track of everything that happens in the match and can be referred to by teachers or coordinators in larger tournaments. So this is how one can use the online version of Propaganda to play multiplayer versions, and you can do it at home, you can do it in classrooms, and you can do it in large tournaments as well. If we have any questions about this, please contact us. We always love to hear from people, and we hope you'll enjoy playing the multiplayer game with your friends and classmates.